My name is Mark Luba with IMS Global, and it's my privilege to introduce our next speaker. Mike Beutry is the Managing Director of Cherrytree, the education-focused investment banker. Mike has a deep background in education technology, corporate strategy, early-stage growth investing, government affairs, and public relations. As Vice President for Public Affairs and Strategy at Capella Education Company, Mike was engaged in multiple aspects of Capella's nearly $2 billion merger with Strayer Education. Prior to joining Cherrytree, Mike worked on creating innovative student loan solutions as entrepreneur in residence at Whiteboard Advisors, a Washington, D.C.-based strategy firm focused on the education sector. Mike is a frequent speaker on developing trends in higher education and workforce development. His previous experience includes working as Chief of Staff to then U.S. Senator Chuck Hagel and serving as Managing Director of CLS, a public services firm in Washington, D.C. Mike received his BA from Creighton University, and he'll be sharing today with us 5 forces shaping the future of higher education. Please welcome Mike Beutry.
Earl, that's not fair to have to follow that story. That was fantastic. I'm not going to do anything to help with the glare problem either. Thank you, Mark and Rob and Sandra and everything that you guys are doing, One Ed Tech. I've followed your work for a long time. Truly impressive, and I'm not surprised that you're growing. And I imagine 2022 is going to be your biggest year yet. I'm excited to be here. I'm excited to be anywhere. Like Mark said, Cherrytree is an investment bank. Saying you're an investment banker is a little like saying you're a doctor. There's a lot of different ways to do that. What we do at Cherrytree is advise on mergers and acquisitions. And so we help companies that are looking to get sold, and we help entities that are looking to acquire other entities. And we do a lot of work in the ed tech space and in the higher education space. When Sandra and Mark and team invited me to do this, we were on a conference call a couple months ago, and I think it was Mark who encouraged me to be provocative. And so I was thinking on the flight down, like, what's the most provocative thing that I could say? And I decided it was that I believe this is a really wonderful time to be in the education space. There's a tremendous amount of change right now, and that is leading to extremely difficult, daunting, challenging times that have really human costs. And we're going to talk about some of those, but they attract most of the headlines, right? The challenges. I honestly believe that we're poised for a period of massive innovation and new models. There's an enormous opportunity to put a tremendous amount of good into the world in the space where IMS One Ed Tech is working. To frame this discussion, like Mark said, I thought I'd go through 5 forces that are impacting the post-secondary education world, adult education. And then, probably more interestingly, talk about some of the implications that flow from those. I don't know if I will clear the bar for being provocative, but hopefully I can clear the bar for being interesting and not boring. And maybe we'll have some time at the end, and we can do a Q&A, and you guys can be provocative. The 5 forces that I want to talk about are 1, declining enrollments, 2, student debt, 3, digitization, 4, a really bizarre labor market, and then 5, a tremendous amount of investment coming into this space. So let's start with enrollment declines. According to the Clearinghouse, over the last 2 years, 2020, 2021, we saw a higher rate of decline in higher education enrollments than at any time in the last 50 years. I'm going to say that again. Over the last 2 years, there was a greater decline in higher education enrollment than at any time in the last 50 years. And it wasn't spread evenly. Selective colleges saw an increase in enrollment of 4%, a modest increase. Community colleges saw a decrease of 14%. And I will tell you, a lot of the conversations that I'm having, 14% seems pretty optimistic. I know that there are institutions that are seeing a lot worse than 14% enrollment declines. There are also challenges underneath those numbers with persistence and retention. There's no question COVID has had a massive impact, but it's not just related to COVID. This was a trend from before 2020. Phil Hill, who's a great, he's an ed tech consultant and a great follow on Twitter, had a great chart that charted the last 10 years of nonprofit enrollments, and it is an upward trend. But if you remove Arizona State, Western Governors, and Liberty and their massive online enrollments from that chart, in 2015 it starts going down, and COVID has been gasoline on that fire. So there's one force impacting higher education, adult education, declining enrollments. Second force, student debt. I could give an entire speech about student debt. I won't make you sit through that. It is ubiquitous as an issue, but I don't think people really fully capture the size and enormity, the magnitude of student debt. The student debt burden in this country is $1.7 trillion, 1.5 trillion of it held by the federal government. To put that in some perspective, $1.7 trillion is more than the gross domestic product of Mexico. It is more than the gross domestic product of Spain. It is more than the GDP of Brazil. America's student debt burden is more than the GDP of Brazil. It is twice the size of what we spend on defense annually. And it's growing. This is shaping a generation of Americans. It's not systemic to the economy in the way that the mortgage crisis was, because most of the debt is held by the federal government, and so it's not being chopped up into destructive, innovative financial instruments, right? But it can't be written off in bankruptcy. So the human cost of this debt is massive. A lot of the attention goes to folks who've borrowed six figures to get graduate degrees, but I think as much or more attention needs to be paid to folks who borrowed $5,000, $10,000 to go to a year of community college and life got in the way, or they weren't ready, they weren't academically prepared to be there, and they weren't successful. That $5,000 to $10,000 of debt, without a credential that helps you pay it off, will inhibit a person's ability to accumulate wealth for the rest of their lives. So why is this happening? First, there's a profound change just in the simple economics of it, right? The New York Times said from the early 80s to now, the cost of tuition and fees has risen faster than the cost of healthcare. I didn't think it was possible for anything to rise faster than the cost of healthcare. Additionally, the CPI over that same period of time has grown 100%. Cost of tuition and fees has grown 400%. Mark said I went to Creighton. I'm 45. That means that I was going to Creighton in the late 90s, which is, I think, inarguably the best time to be alive. We had the best music. Our scandals were quaint. And it was probably the last period of time when large groups of people going to school could work to put themselves through school. It is not a reality anymore in the way that it was for the previous 20 years. The second reason, in addition to just a fundamental change of economics, the Department of Education, they hold $1.5 trillion in debt. They're essentially a bank, and they're a bad bank. In 2020, 1 in 4 student loans was in default, deferment, or forbearance. 1 in 4. That's a bad bank. The Department of Education contracts with servicers to service these loans. There was an Inspector General's report on what a terrible job that they do. And the servicers point at the Department of Education and say, these guys tie our hands. The Department of Education points at the servicers and says, these guys are doing a terrible job. And lost in the wash is the borrowers who are treated terribly throughout the entire process. On top of all this, in 2020, because of COVID, the Department of Education stopped asking people to pay their student loans, which I think is a very, very reasonable thing to do. However, we've gone now 2 years, almost to the day, to the month, and they aren't scheduled to restart loan payments until August. There's no way you can go 2.5 years of not asking people to pay back their loans and then just turn it on and not expect that that 1 in 4 number for distressed loans isn't going to skyrocket. I'll stop on this point, but if you're interested in let me do a commercial real quickly. Josh Mitchell is a reporter for the Wall Street Journal. He wrote a book last year called The Debt Trap about the trail of good intentions that led us to this point, and the policy choices that led us to this situation. I gave it out as a Christmas gift. I gave a book about student debt for Christmas. That's how good it was. So I can't recommend it highly enough. So the third factor, digitization. It is ridiculous to come to IMS and talk to you about the digitization as a force in education, so I won't belabor the point. But I do think that COVID, it has acted as a significant accelerant around digitization. It's broken down the walls of inertia with uneven results, but the idea that we'll go back to the way that it was 2 years ago, the idea that education will ever look like it did on February 28th, 2020 again, it isn't going to happen. Across education, K-12, higher education, corporate education, adult education, it is going to become increasingly digital. It'll never be less digital than it is today. I was thinking about it this morning, just this war, how digital it is. When you see what's going on in Ukraine, we've never been as linked as we are in terms of digital ubiquity. So I'll stop on that point. I'm pushing on an open door. The fourth force pushing on adult education is a truly bizarre labor market. We've not ever seen anything like this before. It is unprecedented. The tools that we have for understanding the labor market don't really work for a gig economy and a digital economy and a post-COVID economy. But we live in a time where those tools tell us we have relatively low unemployment, which is a good thing, and it's largely true. But it doesn't capture underemployment, people who are overqualified for the jobs that they're in. And more importantly, it doesn't capture the turmoil that is going on in the labor market. In October of 2021, 4.1 million people quit their jobs. For perspective, that's 3% of the American workforce. 3% of the American workforce quit their jobs in October. Now, to be sure, some of those people were going to other jobs. The total for 2021 was 38 million people who left their jobs. So one, it shows just the fluidity, unprecedented fluidity in the labor market of people moving from job to job. But not everybody is going to another job. According to BLS, from the 80s to 2008, labor participation was relatively stable at around 66, 67%. Today, it's at 60% and dropping, especially for women. For women, it's at 57% and dropping dramatically. The St. Louis Fed has great numbers on this. Excuse me, that's not right. That was from the BLS. I'm going to talk about the St. Louis Fed in a second. So at the same time, we're seeing the great resignation that Earl was talking about. At the same time, we're seeing people stopping out of the labor market and switching jobs at a greater pace than we ever have before. We're seeing on the demand side, employers who are not able to fill the jobs that they have. The St. Louis Fed says that we have 11 million unfilled jobs in this country. That is high-skilled jobs, medium-skilled jobs, low-skilled jobs, 11 million unfilled jobs. 10 years ago, that number was 3 million. I know it feels like we've been talking about the skills gap for a long time, but the skills gap from 10 years ago, when we had 3 million unfilled jobs, is nothing like a skills gap where we have 11 million unfilled jobs. The signals are broken. The signals that match people with jobs and jobs with people aren't working right now. And the tools to skill people into the jobs that need to be filled are not working. I'm not very smart about this, but you have someone coming up. I saw Paul Fain is speaking. This is an important enough topic that Paul has built an entire media platform trying to explain this. And so I encourage everybody to attend Paul's session and listen to what he has to say. The last kind of force pushing on adult education is an incredible amount of investment and innovation taking place outside of the degreed space. Tony Wan at Reach Capital estimates that in 2021, there was $8.2 billion invested in ed tech. That's a lot of money, but it's especially impressive when you consider that in 2020, the number was $2.2 billion invested in ed tech. Last year, we saw an increase of $6 billion in ed tech investment. And I can tell you just from my day job, I don't think that's slowing down in 2022. I think we're going to be over $8.2 billion this year. There are innumerable exciting companies, many of whom are sponsors here. I don't want to pick winners. I love them all. They're all wonderful. Call me. But there are real reasons for excitement about what is going on in the education technology space. Handshake just raised $200 million. They sit right in that circle of taking people from degree to employment. EdQuity, a relatively small startup, but they're doing tremendous things in terms of maximizing emergency aid for students. Coursera, Rob was talking about Coursera earlier, went public this year, really well received by the market. Duolingo, fascinating company. I know you guys are going to talk about this. You all are smarter about this than me, but the assessment space. In fact, if you're smart about the assessment space, come find me later and help me get as smart as you are. But the assessment space, Emergence says that it's an $11 billion market. It is growing. Large and small players are in that space. The business models haven't necessarily caught up with where they're going to be. But I think you're going to see tremendous innovation in the assessment space. I have a buy-side client in the K-12 space, and I can tell you K-12, every day is exciting when you look at startups, but also just established technologies, what they're doing. And some of it is the prosaic innovations that are required to make transformational things happen, right? It is really exciting in the K-12 space. Finally, I know IMS Global, international, there's a lot of exciting things going on in Europe, especially the UK, Australia. It's a really exciting time globally in the education space. Okay. So if those are the 5 factors, they're not the only 5 factors, but I think they're the 5 most important factors impacting adult education. Enrollment declines, student debt, digitization, a bizarre labor market, and an exciting education technology space. What are the implications that flow from that? I'd start by saying I think at this part of the remarks, a little humility is required because the answer is nobody knows. It's moving really fast. And anybody who says with certainty that they know where it's headed, that person deserves some skepticism. But I do think we're well served to try and figure out where things are going. And so let me offer some of my thoughts. Some of these are positive. I'm going to try to end on some positive ones and talk specifically about things that matter to one ed tech. But some of them are negative too. And let me start with, I think, the most distressing and concerning implication of these forces pressing on adult education. I think the socioeconomic gaps that exist in the country and exist globally, the conditions exist for those gaps to be further stressed. When you look at who is leaving higher education, where that decline in enrollments is coming from, it is from people at the lower end of the socioeconomic scale. When you look at where the student debt burden is most crushing, it is people at the lower end of the socioeconomic scale. And when you look at the people who are least well positioned to navigate increasing digitization, it is frequently people at the lower end of the socioeconomic scale. I think this is a generational challenge. And when you talk about it being a wonderful time to be in technology, I think one of the reasons it's a wonderful time is because I can't imagine a more important problem to solve than that one. But I think right now, the pressures on adult education are going to impact that in a very negative way with significant impacts for society. McKinsey has done some really good work on learning loss in the last 2 years. And the impact of that learning loss and the impact that will have on stratifications in our society, I think we're just beginning to understand, but it is alarming. So I'd offer that as probably the first most concerning implication from the forces impacting adult education. The second one I'd offer is consolidation in higher education. Consolidation within institutions and consolidation between institutions. I have a friend who says that the plural of anecdote is not data. So I don't have data for you on this, but I have a lot of anecdote. I can tell you that there are an enormous number of institutions right now talking about consolidation and talking about how they come together. Unless you have a fortress brand or a fortress endowment, the cost pressures that you are facing require you to think differently as a higher education institution. The good news is a lot of institutions are doing it. The bad news is that it's hard. It's not always easy to find. I'm a deal maker, right? And the deals that we love are when 1 + 1 = 4 or 3. In a lot of these cases, you're like trying to find a deal where 1 + 1 = 2.5 or 2, where the combined strengths of institutions outweigh the combined liabilities of institutions. But I think you're going to see increasing consolidation in higher education over 2020, 2023. Another implication that will come from that is, and this feeds into the third one, regulatory structures right now are not equipped. The accreditors in the Department of Education are not equipped for what is coming in terms of consolidation and in terms of combining institutions. That leads to the third point. Student debt as a policy issue is going to suck up all of the oxygen in the room. There is not going to be attention or bandwidth from policymakers for anything else, and that is an enormous opportunity cost. The law governing higher education, the Higher Education Act, they changed the acronym, but HEA, was last passed before the iPhone. That's insane. This should be an enormous opportunity. Mark said I got my start in government in DC. I believe in policy. I believe that policy has the ability to learn and to test and to create the conditions for superior outcomes. Don't wait for policy to help on this, except around student debt. Right now we're in a position where I think we're just kind of grinding through. We can talk more if you want about student debt, but it is going to suck up all the oxygen in the room, and policy around other areas of innovation is going to pay the price. The fourth implication that I would give you, let's see how we're doing on time. The fourth implication I would give you is hiring and retention practices are changing. And that's a wonderful thing. If you read Paul Fain every week, you see evidence of it. The Wellspring Project, man, that is exactly the right thing to be doing. If employers don't get better at hiring, they're going to suffer and some of them are going to die. If they do get better at hiring, if they do get better at retention, they're going to have a durable competitive advantage. Degrees largely exist today, not largely. A primary function of degrees today is as a sorting mechanism for HR algorithms to sort people out of job candidate pools. We can do a lot better than that. We have the ability and the assessment technology to know what people can do and know where they fit and to fit jobs to what people can do. It is a huge opportunity. Better systems and language for delivering signals, and employers who are open to receiving it and know what they're getting. I think that the first place to look for that, it's already happening at the Googles of the world and the Oracles of the world, okay? The next place to look, there are some really sophisticated, the large healthcare players, the Humanas of the world, the United Healths of the world, they have got this figured out, and they're starting to understand how to hire differently. One of the interesting spaces to watch around hiring, I think, is going to be licensure professions. There's a category of licensure where it's probably too onerous. I started cutting my own hair during COVID to the extent that it was required. And you know, the cost burden of licensure on hairstylists and cosmetologists, it just doesn't make sense anymore, and if it ever did. Where it gets more complicated is nobody wants to be treated, most people don't want to be treated by a nurse who isn't fully licensed. At the same time, we're in a crisis. Domestically and globally, we don't have enough nurses. We got to figure out how to do that differently, and we got to figure out how to do it better while we maintain the same standards of quality. That's a hard thing to do. If I knew how to do it, I would quit what I'm doing now and go do that. I don't. But I do know it's unsustainable on the trajectory that we're on today. And that's a harder area for hiring to change and to innovate. It's going to take policy in order to do that. I'm spending too much time on that one. Next one, the relationship between time and higher education will change. It is already changing, and it will continue to change at a more rapid pace. It is an anachronism of the 20th century that the currency of higher education, both in terms of the degree and what we pay to get the degree, is a time-based metric, credit hours and seat time. Doesn't make sense. In a knowledge economy, in a lifelong learning economy, it doesn't make sense anymore. It used to. It used to make a lot of sense. It no longer does. And this is an area where opportunity cost in policy is going to be really costly, because there are things that can be done around direct assessment degree awarding that are low-hanging fruit that's not going to be plucked, because the only thing we have time for is student debt. And that's right? Student debt's a crisis. That should be the number one priority. But we're not going to get to things like direct assessment and workable direct assessment systems until we're past that. I don't mean to retread what I was already saying. Amy Leighton at the New America Foundation wrote a wonderful white paper called Cracking the Credit Hour. I think it's like a decade old, but it is as relevant in 2022 as it was when Amy wrote it. I encourage everybody here to read it. The other thing that I would say in terms of time and higher education, the concept of a 2-year degree and a 4-year degree are dinosaur concepts. 5 years from now, I don't think people will say those words. I don't think we will measure degrees based in years. The last thing that I would say before I talk specifically about One EdTech, implication from the forces pressing on higher education. I think we're going to see a tremendous period of creative destruction in adult education. And I think creative is one of the most beautiful words in the English language, and destruction is one of the ugliest. And I think we're going to see a lot of beautiful, wonderful things, and we're going to see a lot of ugly, really hard things over the next 5 years. It will be required, and the resources for transformation exist. I think this is an enormously exciting time. This is working, and it needs to change, and we're starting to see it breaking. Google last week with their $100 million certificate fund, on its own, it's not that big a deal. But when you start thinking about Google's $100 million certificate fund with Salesforce trying to train anybody alive to be able to use Salesforce technology, you start seeing the seedlings of what the new normal will start to look like. And I think that there's reason for excitement. I tell people, man, I think ed tech is more exciting than Bitcoin. They're both very different, but I would leave you with this thought about why I'm excited. I think people want to work at a time when your work has meaning and impact. You want to work at a time that requires dramatic progress, right? Incremental progress won't do. And we certainly live at that time. Urgency is required to meet the moment. And the work that organizations like One EdTech is doing couldn't be more important. This is a magnificent time for digital transformation, to be talking about interoperability, to be talking about the right kind of agile architecture. That is at the heart of the kind of changes that need to take place to deliver on the promise of the moment and to deal with the challenges of the moment, especially socioeconomic stratification that is going to be accelerating. So I will stop there. I really appreciate the opportunity to come speak with you. I don't know how much time I've talked. All right, we have like 10 minutes. Do we want to do any questions or comments? I don't know if Mark, how did I do in terms of being provocative? Okay. I steered out of it. There's a microphone here.
I got it, Rob. I got it.
Okay.
Oh, no, right there.
Hi. Oh, wow, sorry. Andy Miller. I work at IMS in the digital credentials field, so kind of right up what we're talking about here. The consolidations that you were talking about, what impact will they have on the rising costs of education, or what has been a rapidly rising cost of education going forward as more consolidations take place?
Great question. So the answer, this is another space where humility is required. The answer is, I don't know. I thought about saying one of my implications for if you think about all the forces pressing on higher education, one of the implications should be that prices have to come down. There is enormous price pressure, but we don't have a lot of data to show that. And it has seemed enormously resistant to price pressure. And I don't know if I can fully explain it. It should, so I can't explain some of it, right? There's one, price in higher education is just ridiculously opaque. Nobody pays, there's no sticker price. Two, the federal government provides kind of an umbrella of student loan numbers under which anyone can set their tuition. And so capital to fund up to a certain point is always available. And so that creates an incentive not to lower your price below that. Three, you have to get to a level of scale. You don't have to, but if you're going to compete on price, you have to get scale benefit. You have to get leverage from lowering your price. And my experience is the fixed cost structures of most traditional higher education institutions don't allow them to do that. And so I guess I would say I struggle to see that. Now, where you do see it, I think Western Governors is one of the members. I don't know if there's anybody from Western Governors here today. They're delivering higher education at significant scale, and they're able to price to have a lower price point. The other, I'm talking too much about this, but the other thing I'd say, another reason why I think that price is so resistant to pressure, market pressures, we don't have other good metrics for quality in higher education, and so for a long, long time, price has been a signal for quality. And so I guess until that changes, it's hard to see that happening, or you have other entrants who are just taking so much share that there's no other choice. But then you're in kind of a downward spiral. Was that depressing?
Hi, I'm Andrea with IMS. I'm interested, you talked about bringing together employers and people with skills through technology. And I know this has been a conversation within our community, but how do we ensure And what are others doing to ensure that we remove and minimize bias and be equitable in the implementations of these sorts of things, because it really is people behind the scenes making a lot of this coding decision, and I worry about that.
I think you should worry about it. I think it's a really hard problem to solve. I want to be careful not to disclose. So I'm familiar with a assessment company overseas who is growing rapidly, and they're expanding. They're based in Europe, and they're expanding in Southeast Asia. And the U.S. should be a wonderful market for them. And our EEOC laws won't let, I think that's a manageable problem. They think, hey, I've got a lot of other easier places to go where I don't have to work with those EEOC laws. I think you can make the argument that some of those EEOC laws are having the opposite effect of what was intended. If you are able to craft really thoughtful, well-done assessments, I think it doesn't feel like that to people who've been working in the assessment space for years and years. I think we're really early in assessment. And I don't think we can, humility is required. I should have answered your question by saying I don't know. I think we're really early to be able to do assessment in thoughtful ways that takes out bias. I guess you can't take out bias, that accounts for bias and sees it. But I also know it's not an unsolvable problem, right? And so that's a long way of saying I don't know. Sorry. I'm just a banker.
More questions?
Let me make one more point that I don't think I made in my remarks as it relates to employers and assessment entities working together, or other entities working with employers on hiring. It is a mistake, and I've done it today in these remarks. I've made a mistake. Talking about employers is useless. There's no such thing as talking about employers. It's like a geologist talking about the earth. There are startup employers, there are middle market employers, there are large-scale employers, there are healthcare employers, there are education employers. There are different job categories within employment. Everybody's hiring for softwares. People are hiring for hardware. The winners who make the most impact in terms of helping employers take friction out of the hiring process and identify sticky employees who they can retain are going to be the ones who are able to differentiate among the different entities doing the hiring.
I want to hear what Callie wants to say. Thank you for that. And I think the same thing is in the education market. I think that it's very confusing for people talking about higher education or adult education in aggregate, because it's really so many different markets. I mean, I'm here from the Cal State University, where we have 500,000 students, and we educate them for an average of about $12,000 a year. That's not what we charge. That's what it costs us to do the education. We have lots of problems. We're doing lots of things wrong, but we're doing some things right too. And in fact, I can't even understand what people spend $40,000 or $50,000 a student on. I can't even figure it out. But there's so many different models, comparing what we do to what Coursera does, to what American Public does, to what Western Governors does, to what University of Michigan does. And I think it's just terribly confusing. I think I really resonate with yours. I don't know, because I think the future is so cloudy. But I don't see, in many cases, those who are coming into the market or doing the investment really understanding those distinctions. And I see them coming, say, to the Cal State to try to sell a tool like, we can make you look more like Coursera. It's like, well, I don't know whether that's a good thing or not, but I sure as heck know that the presidents of Cal State University don't want to look more like Coursera. So it's not an easy sale to make. So just a comment. I know you're aware of that, but you know, when you know, you mentioned like the enrollment numbers 5% decline, but some, you know, as you point out, some areas have gone up at the same time. So it's very, very complex and dynamic. You've got 4,500 people who call themselves higher education presidents, and the mix of incentives they have, it's like talking about shoe stores or something. I mean, it's just, anyway.
I agree 1,000%. I've struggled with it just in his remarks, right? I've pinged back and forth between adult education, post-secondary education, higher education. If the Cal State system wanted to look like Coursera, they could buy Coursera products. It's not that complicated. And so I see a lot of startups in this space. The smart ones have already figured it out, but a lot of the startups do treat it like a monolith, and they won't succeed.
I'm just going to add one quick little thing. If we're going to ask employers, this great big huge group, to change the way that they're hiring people, we may want to start at home.
Yes, strongly agree. When I worked at Capella, is Catherine Green here? My friend Catherine, my old colleague? I don't know if she's watching online. When I worked at Capella, we were really frustrated because Capella's competency-based, and we have these wonderful competency maps that every student, every learner was getting along the way, and at the end they had this competency map, and we wanted employers to give us credit for that, and we didn't use them. And that was one of our CEO's points, is like, we have to eat our own dog food. Like, we have to change how we do this, and I think we did to some effect.
All right, let's thank Michael.